Well, hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Got a really great guest. This is Dr. James D. Nicolantonio. We're going to talk about salt. We're going to talk about minerals and how critical they are. And most of us have heard that salt is bad for us. And so we're going to talk about that as well and how much salt we should be consuming for optimal health. So if you guys don't know Dr. James D. Nicolantonio, he's a doctor of pharmacy, cardiovascular research scientist, very well respected. He's been a co-author of over 250 publications in the medical literature. And he's the author of 5 best-selling health books: The Salt Fix, Super Fuel, The Longevity Solution, The Immunity Fix, and The Mineral Fix. And of course, you can find him on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. He's always got some great posts that you guys can check out as well. And also his website, Dr. James, D-I-N-I-C. So drjamesdinic.com. Check out his website, sign up for his newsletter as well. He's always dropping really good information there as well. So Dr. James, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, the first book that I read that you had put out was The Salt Fix. And I know for myself, and I've been on a low carb diet and doing intermittent fasting now for 15 years, that I craved. In fact, part of my health recovery, I was actually craving salt. And this was back in 2005, 2006. I had irritable bowel and I was recovering from that. And I craved salt. I needed it. It was the only way I really would get energy. And of course, I was taking exercise physiology and I was in medical school, and, I was being taught that, to avoid salt and to reduce it. But I knew that it was improving my health. And, you obviously wrote a whole book about it called The Salt Fix. So let's start there. Let's talk about salt, why it was demonized, why it's so important for our health.
It was originally demonized just due to blood pressure. And very similarly, there were scientists back in like the 1950s that were demonizing salt, similar to how we demonize saturated fat. They would look at correlations to where certain populations that consumed a higher amount, it was correlated that, high salt intake may increase blood pressure. So actually, it was a clinical study looking at 6 populations. But inner salt came out in the, obviously basically 50 years later, looked at 52 countries. And when you eliminated the 4 primal, populations that were consuming very, very low amounts, you actually had a drop in blood pressure as salt intake increased. So the studies were short studies looking at a limited amount of populations, trying to find a correlation. And really that's where most of our guidance comes from, because all of our nutritional guidance stems from the 1970s, basically where this was before you had systematic reviews and meta-analyses of actual clinical studies.
Right.
And in those dietary goals that came out in 1977, and then the first dietary guidelines in 1980, they started recommending low salt for everyone, low saturated fat, low total fat, high amount of carbohydrate intakes. So everything really stems from there. And that's really where basically we went wrong.
So these were basically large epidemiological studies looking at kind of surveys of what people were consuming. Is that correct? And
Right.
Also obviously, which those studies can show correlation, but they can't show direct causation. So there were just hypotheses that were brought about. And sometimes hypothesis, when scientists say them enough, they no longer become hypothesis, they become, scientific truth, I guess you could say. But ultimately, we didn't really have true interventional studies that were demonstrating that actually was causation.
Exactly. And I mean, even worse too, is they were cherry picking the population they were looking at. And same thing happened with saturated fat. They cherry picked the 6-country study. And even though there was, a total of 23 countries. So when you added all the countries back, there was no increase in heart disease with saturated fat. And same thing with salt. When you added, 50 countries back, you didn't see that rise in blood pressure with higher salt intakes.
Yeah, so important. And of course, when people are on low carb diets, like a lot of my listeners are, or if they're fasting, there's an even greater need for salt. And a lot of people don't realize that. And oftentimes they can develop things like the keto flu as they get going with it.
Right. Yeah. So what happens is most people are consuming a moderate to high amount of carbohydrates every single day. And then they discover keto, and then they drop the carb intake and their insulin levels drop. And insulin helps the kidneys actually hold on to salt. So typically the first 1 to 2 weeks, you have a pretty massive loss of sodium and fluid, which leads to the keto flu. And so the chronic effects too of going on a low carb intake is that glucose actually helps you absorb sodium. And glucose helps you move sodium in and out, and same with sodium, vice versa, in and out of the cell. So you chronically need more amounts of salt when you're not eating a large amount of carbohydrate.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you start implementing that salt, you definitely feel better. Now, what types of salt should people be looking for? Like, what are the best types that are out there? There's Himalayan salt, there's gray salts like Celtic, Redmond's Real Salt's another good brand. What are some of the benefits of each of those, and which of those do you really prefer?
So how I like to look at it is salt typically will have 2 minerals besides sodium and chloride in fairly clinically significant amounts, either iodine or magnesium. So the salts that will help support iodine would be the pink Himalayans, including Redmond. If you're someone who needs more magnesium, you have to go and reach for the Icelandic salts, or Australian flat salts. They typically have, 10 times, at least 10 times more magnesium. And some of them can actually have up to 180 milligrams of magnesium per 10 grams of salt.
So that would be like the Celtic, and you said like Australian gray salt or Australian flatland salt?
Yeah, so Celtic salt actually does have a decent amount of magnesium. That's typically around 40 milligrams of magnesium per 10 grams of salt. The higher magnesiums would be the Icelandic.
Icelandic.
Yeah, Icelandic salt. One of them is called Saltwerk. And then a lot of the Australian flat salts that have basically dried up from ancient oceans also have very high amounts of magnesium.
Okay. And then how about Redmond's Real Salt? I know I've heard you say that you really like that salt as well.
Right. That one has about 170 micrograms of iodine per 10 grams of salt. And we need about 150. And so I do like that, especially with exercise, because you lose not just salt in sweat, you actually lose about 50 micrograms of iodine per hour of exercise through sweat. So it's a good salt to actually get iodine from.
Yeah. And iodine is one of those things a lot of people are deficient in. Is that correct?
Yeah. So there's still, I think, around at least 48 countries that are considered iodine insufficient.
Yeah.
But there's that narrow range with iodine for a lot of people where you want to sort of keep it between the 150 and 300 microgram per day mark. And if you start going over that, sometimes you can cause thyroid issues, especially if you're not optimizing your selenium intake. So if you start doing a lot of iodine and your selenium's really low, you can start messing the thyroid function up.
Yeah, for sure. And so are there any issues with just typical table salt, iodized salt that's out there?
I think the more of the issue is not getting salt. So if you don't have a choice, or if you look in your cupboard and you don't have like these unrefined salts, of course, sodium and chloride is the primary benefit of salt. Of course, would it be better to get something that's unrefined, that doesn't have dextrose, that's not treated with a lot of harsh chemicals, or even sometimes they use explosives to get some of those salts out of the mines. But so if you can get unrefined salts, great. If not, it's still more important to support your salt intake throughout the day.
Yeah. So your typical table salt's better than no salt. But if you have the preference, you're looking at some sort of unrefined salt, some sort of really high quality salt. If you need more magnesium, you're looking at Icelandic salt or those Australian salts that you had mentioned.
Yep.
If you have a greater need for iodine, you're looking at more of your Himalayan sea salt or your Redmond's Real Salt.
Exactly.
Cool. All right. So good to know as far as that goes. Now, your most recent book here is The Mineral Fix. Okay. So let's talk about key minerals. Obviously, we're already talking about salt, magnesium a little bit. What are some signs that people are deficient in minerals, and what's the prevalence of this?
Well, if we look at magnesium, because everybody likes to talk about that one, that's the easiest one. We have the best data on it. About 50% of Americans aren't consuming the RDA for magnesium, which is about 400 milligrams per day for an adult. Most people need about an extra 150 milligrams just to get to the RDA, which is close to optimal, but really not. Optimal intakes of magnesium seem to be more around 600 to 700 milligrams per day. So most people are actually about 300 milligrams to 400 milligrams non-optimized. They need that much more to get to an optimal level. So high prevalence of magnesium deficiency. And now you might say, well, that's just from intake data. If you actually look at IV magnesium load tests on certain individuals, if people have been on a thiazide diuretic for 6 months or longer, 80% of those people are magnesium deficient. 50% of people with high blood pressure or heart disease at any given time will be magnesium deficient based on IV magnesium load tests, which is the gold standard. Basically, give someone an IV load of magnesium, and then you see how much comes out in the urine over 24 hours. If the body's holding on to a lot of it, you know you're deficient. It's like the best way to test for magnesium deficiency. Now, of course, that's an invasive procedure. So the one blood test that has actually been shown to match IV magnesium load is something called mononuclear blood cell magnesium. So you can try to order that. Or if you can't, simply looking at a blood test, and if you're sitting on the lower end of normal, that's highly indicative that you are actually deficient, because the body tries to maintain a normal level. So by the time, if you actually have a significantly low level of magnesium, you've been deficient for a long time. But if you're riding on the lower end of normal, that's actually indicative that some of your organs are actually deficient in magnesium.
Right, exactly. And so I can't remember exactly the measurements, but your typical blood test, you're looking at your RBC magnesium, and it's like 2.0 is if it's under 2, can't remember exactly the measurement there, but if it's under 2, then you're deficient, which is very rare that I see somebody actually flagged deficient on the lab.
Right.
But you're saying basically if you're bordering that 2.0, 2.1 or something like that, that you're already deficient. And I know that test really is, that lab in general, those ranges are really wide. So, it's never been something that, in functional medicine that we really don't use that RBC magnesium as an indicator. We're looking more at symptoms, but it makes sense with what you're saying that if you're starting to trend low, then that's a sign that you're already deficient.
Right. So basically, if you're looking at like a blood test, not a red blood cell, but if you're actually just looking at like a serum,
you're a serum,
typically normal is considered even down to 1.7. You're still normal. You won't be flagged deficient. Right. But we put out a review paper indicating that if you're less than 2 milligrams per deciliter, that's highly indicative of magnesium deficiency. So you can see that you have a reference range of, let's say, 1.7 to 2.2 being normal, but less than 2 is likely actually deficient.
Okay. So that's a very easy test to run. I think it's just part of your comprehensive metabolic panel, right? So most of our listeners, if you're getting like yearly blood work done, most people are getting complete blood count, comprehensive metabolic panel should be in there. You're looking at that serum magnesium, and if it's under 2.0 milligram per deciliter, that's the measurement.
Yep.
And that's clearly a sign that you're magnesium deficient. But there are other symptoms too that people can look out for as well, right?
Absolutely. And we got to be careful though too, because a lot of people have what's called subclinical mineral deficiencies, where it's not, you don't even have symptoms, but you're deficient. But yes, a lot of people will have symptoms too, typically muscle cramps, eyelid spasms, headaches, photophobia. So if you are intolerant to light, that's pretty indicative of magnesium deficiency.
Oh, that's good to know. Yep. Also, if you have electromagnetic sensitivity, I've heard as well, that can be an indication of poor magnesium status.
Sure. That makes sense.
Yeah. So really good things to know. And also like muscle twitching, there's a whole list of symptoms. I know you go over it in your book as well. But a lot of muscle issues, nerve issues can be related to magnesium deficiency, headaches, different things like that. So yeah, it is a really big issue. And, when you supplement with magnesium or you eat a lot of magnesium rich foods, the way that that you have too much magnesium typically is loose stools, right? That's really the only major downside for most people. There are some people that may be a little bit sensitive here and there, but for most people, it's just loose bowels. Has that been your observation as well?
Yep, totally agree. Magnesium is sort of self-limiting in regards to if you consume too much, you'll essentially have those loose stools. So it is a very safe compound. I do find that people do better actually taking slightly lower doses, more frequent throughout the day, rather than large bolus doses.
Yeah.
Right.
The large dose is good if you want to move your bowels, but for really optimizing magnesium status, you want to take those lower doses throughout the day.
Yeah.
Now, how should somebody, you mentioned low doses throughout the day. What are some of the best magnesium rich foods? And there's a lot of different supplemental forms. What are some of your favorite forms for supplementation?
So I actually I consider this almost like a dietary source and a supplement at the same time. And that's high magnesium mineral waters. And the reason is because the bioavailability is basically as high as you can get because it's already dissolved in solution. And so the ionic form of minerals, particularly calcium and magnesium, is going to have basically your highest absorption. And so I typically consume waters like Gerolsteiner or San Pellegrino, but Gerolsteiner is a little higher. It has about 100 milligrams of magnesium per liter. So if I consume 2 liters, I'm getting 200 milligrams of magnesium for the day, which when I add that to my diet, that's going to help get me to the 400 that I'm shooting for. Spinach is a good source of magnesium. So typically I look at more plant foods as a better source of calcium and magnesium, and animal foods is sort of like iron, zinc, B12, things like that.
Yeah, that makes sense. So eating your magnesium rich foods, drinking your magnesium water. Now, when it comes to supplementation, what are some of the better forms? Because there's magnesium glycinate, bisglycinate, threonate, orotate, right? Citrate, right? All the different types. What should somebody be looking for there?
So magnesium orotate is interesting. It actually acts as a prolonged release beta alanine. It gets converted to that substance. So it's interesting because beta alanine is sort of the best way to boost carnosine levels. And then it's actually like magnesium orotate circumvents the pins and needles that you get from beta alanine. So it's really good for exercise performance. There are studies testing magnesium orotate in heart failure, showing significant improvements in survival. Threonate is great for brain health because it can cross the blood-brain barrier. So anything related to brain health, threonate is going to be probably your best option. Citrate is good for inhibiting acid loads in regards to high animal-based diets, or also for helping with loose stools if you go high doses, helping with constipation, excuse me. And then glycinate is probably one of your better absorbed magnesiums because it's chelated to glycine.
Right. And glycine is necessary for phase 2 liver detox, right? And a lot of people aren't getting enough glycine to begin with. So that's a good form. Yeah. Threonate, like you mentioned, for brain. So for good memory, there's good studies there, on hippocampal function. So memory retention and preventing against, memory loss, things like that. So really good as far as that goes. Citrate, the other interesting thing about citrates is they help bind to oxalates in our gut. So whether you're taking like a potassium citrate or magnesium citrate or something like that. And a lot of people have issues with oxalates. We talked about that on the podcast. So sometimes getting some extra citrates into the gut and into the urine can help bind and pull oxalates out.
Yeah, that's a good point. And actually there's a citrate in the urine too, helps reduce kidney stone formation.
Yeah, because, calcium oxalate stones.
Calcium oxalates from forming, correct.
That's right. Yeah. So really good. Okay. So we talked about magnesium and, I'm huge on that as well. I really think most people respond really well to magnesium supplementation, and you brought in that magnesium rich water too, which is a great thing. So you said San Pellegrino, right? It's an easy one that people can buy at the store. You mentioned another type as well, another type of water. What was that?
That one is called Gerolsteiner water. It's a German underground water. And that actually has more bicarbonate in it and about twice the magnesium as San Pellegrino.
Okay, Gerolsteiner. So with the bicarbonate, is it like naturally alkaline?
Yeah, so it contains about 1,800 milligrams of bicarb per liter. And what's good about consuming bicarb from a water is that's already dissolved in solution. So it's not like taking high doses of sodium bicarb that's going to inhibit stomach acid. It's going to be absorbed pretty quickly and move away from the stomach and get absorbed within 15 minutes.
Interesting. And people can order that online, because I don't remember seeing that at a store.
It's at a lot of grocery stores now.
Is it? Okay. Gerolsteiner. Okay. So we'll have to look out for that. All right, cool. Now let's talk about some other key minerals. You had mentioned iodine earlier. Let's touch on that a little bit.
Sure. There's this really cool connection I talk about in the book between sodium and iodine. Sodium is like a universal molecule that the body uses to move a lot of things around, including iodine. Without sodium, you cannot drive iodine into the actual thyroid gland, and you can't drive it into the mammary gland. So basically what ends up happening is, if let's say a lactating woman isn't getting enough salt, you're not going to be able to drive the iodine into the milk because you're not driving into the mammary gland. So that can be a big issue because we know iodine's really important for, at least the first year, especially
Yeah.
for health, and obviously in utero too. So in pregnancy, salt and iodine, very, very important because you're basically, it's like 2 blood volumes you're carrying. And so a lot of studies actually show that more salt in pregnancy, like twice a normal intake, seems to be optimal for a lot of women.
That's good to know. We just had a newborn actually. So, our 4th child. So
Yeah.
yeah, so I had my wife obviously taking good salts, things like that, all along. But yeah, I didn't even know that. But yeah, iodine is super critical for the baby's brain development. When mom is iodine deficient, oftentimes the baby's born and they're higher risk for mental retardation, for a lot of different issues with brain development. So yeah, super, super important. And that's interesting that there's this key relationship here with sodium and iodine as well. And earlier you had mentioned as well iodine and selenium. Selenium is another big deficiency.
Yeah, selenium. Well, there's this COVID connection too with selenium that
Yeah,
people
true.
that are from low selenium areas are at about a 5-fold higher risk of dying from COVID and about a 3-fold higher risk of having a poor
Wow.
COVID outcome. And that's probably because selenium helps code our antioxidant enzymes and reduces protein oxidation. And selenium also helps support glutathione peroxidase. So, in the mineral fix, one of the key things is that we need to think of minerals as antioxidants, not just
Yeah,
vitamins. In fact,
right.
minerals are literally make up our antioxidant enzymes,
Mm,
including manganese superoxide dismutase in the mitochondria. So if you want to protect the mitochondria from oxidative stress as well, you have to have good manganese status. So there's this importance of antioxidant functions with minerals, especially selenium, for supporting numerous antioxidant enzymes.
yeah, selenium is critical for that. And that's an interesting note there that we have to think about minerals as antioxidants because we're typically thinking of glutathione, we're thinking of vitamin C, vitamin E, vitamin A, vitamin D as antioxidants. But we really have to look at, and we're thinking of, carotenoids and all these types of phytochemicals, but minerals really play an important role. Selenium, you mentioned, helping recycle those glutathione proteins and helping form glutathione, super critical. And also zinc. Zinc plays a really critical role in immunity and so many other things. Can you talk more about zinc?
Sure. So I think because most of us have been taught that animal foods are not healthy,
Yeah.
the zinc intake for most of the population is very low. It might not actually be low from an RDA perspective, but from an optimal intake to help with antiviral effects, we're probably consuming 3 times less than what we should be.
Mm,
Because a lot of the studies, when you have like a cold or a flu, they give around, per day, 60 milligrams of zinc. So the
yeah.
average person might only be consuming 15 milligrams per day. So we're pretty low on our zinc intake, and that definitely hurts our immunity for sure.
Yeah, for sure. And really with zinc too, when you're taking higher doses of zinc, like especially if you're trying to fend off a cold or a fever or flu, typically you'll get nausea if you're taking too much. Usually that's kind of like the warning sign. And there's also a zinc tally test. Are you familiar with that? It's kind of
Nope.
like basically you drink like this zinc, this form of zinc. It's basically like an elemental zinc. And normally it doesn't taste good, and you should notice it. But if you're not noticing any flavor with it, it's a sign you're zinc deficient because zinc plays such a critical role in like our sensations, like drinking, like with COVID, for example, one of the classic symptoms was people were losing their sense of smell, right?
Right.
And that was very much related to the zinc deficiency because it's so important for those sensations.
Right. Good point.
Yeah. And zinc and copper also play a critical role. And you can actually get your serum copper plasma zinc test done. And you can look at a ratio there. Usually I'm looking at like 1 to 1.2. This is something that, my health coaching team, we look at people's copper to zinc ratio. Because if you're taking too much zinc, you can deplete your copper. That's
Yeah.
rare though. Most of the time people have more copper than zinc unless they've been supplementing with really high doses of zinc. And copper is more easily absorbed than zinc. Have you found that as well?
Yep. Yeah. There's this whole story on zinc and copper, and I think probably from a standpoint of 60 to 70% of the population is really consuming a lot of these refined foods. Most people are deficient in both of these
Yeah.
minerals.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it's critical. And then you also need good stomach acid to be able to absorb zinc. And it's a kind of vicious cycle because you need zinc to produce stomach acid.
Right.
But if you have low stomach acid, which most people do because they have gut dysbiosis or eating too quickly on the go, things like that, then you can't absorb zinc and a lot of these minerals like iron, things like that effectively as well.
Yeah, and then here again, salt ties back into this
Mm,
because chloride is required for the hydrochloric acid, and low
mm,
salt diets have been shown to reduce stomach acid and increase the pH of the stomach. So you don't digest food as well on a low salt diet, which means you don't
yeah.
absorb all your nutrients as well on a low salt diet.
So right back to salt where we
Comes back
started.
to salt. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So when it comes to salt, tying back into this, how should people be consuming salt? Should they be like intentionally taking like some salt, putting it on their tongue? Should they be just salting their foods well? Are there natural foods that they can be eating that are more sodium rich that they can be consuming?
So the problem with salt intake nowadays is several fold. Number one, we don't consume the salty blood and interstitial fluid. So
Right.
we were pretty much hyper carnivores for a couple million years. When we invented fire, and our brains got smarter, we started hunting larger animals and we started consuming lots of more salty blood. We don't have those salty fluids anymore. So and especially when you go on a low carb diet and you start eating real food, that food no longer has the salt that you need. So you have to add it somehow, whether you salt to taste, which is typically what I do. I'll salt my food to taste.
Yeah.
And I listen to my salt cravings because just like we don't try to measure out how much water we need per day, we listen to our thirst. We also have a salt thermostat that controls how much salt we need to eat. And we know this because humans used to follow animals to salt licks. So animals have this inherent understanding that when they're deficient, they go out and seek it. They get a greater reward when they're deficient from it. And then after they've had too much, they'll get this sort of hyper salty taste and they'll stop ingesting it. Same thing happens with humans. So if you don't listen to your salt cravings, you can get yourself into some serious trouble.
Yeah, super important. They used to say, you're worth your weight in salt as well, right? That was the term because salt's so good for preserving things. And so, for food storage before we had refrigeration and things like that, we obviously used to use salt to help store food. And it's a key part of fermentation. So a lot of fermented foods, like for example, when I'm fasting, sometimes I just crave pickle brine, right? And
Yeah,
it's really the salt that's in the pickle brine.
absolutely. I mean, something that I drink all the time. If I'm
Yeah.
having like a sugar craving, I'll just have some pickle juice, and then typically that craving goes away pretty quickly.
Yeah, again, it's the salt. So if you're having a lot of cravings, particularly sweet, sugary types of cravings, or like cravings for chips,
Mhm.
usually that's an indication that you're not getting enough salt.
Precisely. Yeah. And all these low salt products are sort of causing us to overeat because your
Yeah,
body is going to consume 3 bags of those low salt potato chips to get the salt that the body demands.
man, it's such a good point. So you're going to have more of these kind of starchy cravings, driving up your blood sugar, causing more of a just blood sugar roller coaster, more inflammation in your system. You're really not addressing the root and what you really need there. So yeah, critical with that. Now, when it comes to salt as well, so you're basically just salting your foods to taste. That's what you're looking for. Are there other symptoms? Have you noticed? One thing I've noticed is I'll have people like if they have allergies or some sort of like a histamine type reaction,
Mm,
a little bit of salt on the tongue. And
mm.
actually, salt helps to have like a natural antihistamine effect. Have you noticed that?
Interesting. I haven't actually,
Yeah.
but I've never really looked at that before. But there
I've
are
I've tried this out with a whole bunch of different people, and
okay.
most people tell me they feel better, right?
Wow,
So
that's awesome.
the rationale is that basically histamine acts as a triage system for hydration.
Mm,
So you want to follow it up with water too. You want to drink some water.
right.
And so when we are dehydrated, we start naturally ramping up histamine to bring water into major, visceral organs, our brain, things like that.
Mm,
And sometimes, for some people, they're overproducing the histamine. So they start to have basically, they're not able to break it down effectively. So they start to having unwanted responses like runny nose or a headache or, feeling drowsy, things like that. And then adding a little bit of the salt, getting some of the minerals in there, and the water helps, direct the water where it needs to go.
Right.
And it helps calm down some of those symptoms. So really interesting.
That makes complete sense. And the largest number of emails that I've gotten in regards to how salt has fixed someone's health is atrial fibrillation. I've
Mhm.
had so many emails of people
Yeah.
saying, James, I just decided to kind of say no to my doctor on this low salt diet thing that I've done for years. Within a day or two of eating just what my body was craving, my AFib is gone. So it's really interesting on the electrical current and conduction with the heart, that if you're not getting enough salt, you can throw people into arrhythmias.
Yeah, so interesting. Now let's talk about potassium as well,
Mhm.
and also ways to measure. Because, like, again, on your comprehensive metabolic panel, you get a measurement for your sodium levels and your potassium levels. And does that really tell us anything? So let's talk about that as well.
So a sodium level really tells you more on your hydration status. So typically, if you are dehydrated, you'll have a high sodium level.
Mm,
And if you have overconsumed water, which typically happens like in triathlons, you'll have a low sodium level.
right.
So it doesn't really tell you your salt intake. Really, a BUN, a measurement of plasma volume or dehydration, is more of a better look at your blood volume, and that's controlled by your sodium. So if you have a high BUN, that's pretty indicative of, as long as you're consuming normal amounts of water, pretty indicative of not getting enough salt and having too low of a blood volume.
Good to know. Yep. So BUN is something, again, you're going to be looking at. It's, one of your normal kidney markers. It's a comprehensive metabolic panel. So you can look at that. Typically, ideally it should be like under 20, somewhere around like 11 to 20, somewhere in that range. If it's up over 20, it's a sign that, there's some issues going on, typically with the kidneys, not being able to filter out as much of the urea, and it's getting up in the blood. And so you're saying, hey, now this is a sign, could be a sign, as long as you're hydrating well,
Right.
that you may be deficient in sodium.
Right.
Yeah, interesting. Now, how about potassium? Let's talk about the importance of potassium, how to test for potassium levels.
So the biggest mistake that I see people do is they just start increasing their salt intake, and typically they have a terrible potassium intake, and
Yeah.
that's a disaster for salt retention. So, when you go below 3 grams of potassium per day, you can't really handle a normal amount of salt very well. So you have to make sure that you're hitting at least 3 grams of potassium throughout the day, preferably 4 grams, because that helps you be able to handle a normal amount of salt, whether it's, getting in and out of the cell. And magnesium has very similar effects too. So really, if you fix about 4 key factors: insulin resistance, low magnesium, low potassium, and a high acid load,
Yeah.
most people should be able to handle a normal amount of salt, and they'll actually benefit
Mm.
from that.
Now, 3 to 4 grams of potassium is a lot of potassium. So, what are some of the best food sources to get that?
Beans, potatoes, so lightly cooked potatoes. A lot of people fear potatoes, but they're one of the most filling foods if you don't drench them in butter, and you don't overcook them, because they're a good source of fiber and they're an excellent source of potassium. So I like to consume some lightly cooked organic potatoes. Um, Also, spinach is a fairly good source of potassium. Some more of your plant foods. I mean, animal foods too, because it's in the cell, are fairly good amounts of potassium. But typically, if you're strictly eating a carnivore diet, it's going to be very, very difficult to get above 3 grams of potassium per day. That's when I start adding in like beans or lightly cooked potatoes or greens, things like that.
Gotcha. Now, what if somebody's fasting? Like, what if they're fasting for a day, maybe doing a 3-day fast? Should they be looking to take a potassium supplement, something like that?
So by day 2 of a fast, typically most people are in what's called mild metabolic acidosis. It's not life-threatening, but it does start breaking down the bone. And that's why you see an elevation in magnesium and calcium in the urine on day 2 of a fast, is because of the mild metabolic acidosis. So the simplest thing to do is to take bicarbonate mineral waters when you fast, because that'll inhibit the acid load from all the acidic ketones that are being produced. And
Mhm.
then you'll have a much lower loss of magnesium and calcium out the urine. There doesn't seem to be a huge potassium loss with fasting. And when you do see it, it's just basically due to the breakdown of muscle and not like a true loss, so to speak, because you don't need as much potassium, because after, a couple of days of fasting, you are losing some muscle.
Right.
So I don't know if you need potassium per se, but you definitely need salt, because you continually lose sodium despite not eating any.
Right, for sure. Yeah. And most people notice they feel a lot better when they're fasting, when they are doing the salt or doing like pickle juice, pickle brine, like you were talking about.
Yep.
And so now let's talk about low carb diet. Because you mentioned potatoes, beans, typically not things people are consuming if they're on a ketogenic diet. They might cycle out of ketosis and consume a sweet potato, consume squash, beans, white potatoes, things like that. But if you're on a low carb diet, what are some of the best potassium sources? Avocados, are they a good source? Lemons, limes, what are some of the good things to consume?
Yeah, definitely avocados and fish. Fish are
Yeah.
a good source. If you can tolerate tomatoes, they're like red sauce is a good source of potassium too. So that's going to be a low carb source. And then if you can make beans more of a low carb source by, again, lightly cooking them and even cooling them for 8 hours in the refrigerator. And then basically most of it is becoming fiber. You're not even, absorbing the glucose.
Huh, interesting. Yep. Wow. So again, avocados. How about lemons and limes and berries? Are berries a good source of potassium?
Those would not be a very good source of
Yeah.
potassium. I'm trying to think if there's anything. I mean, nuts are a fairly good source of
Yeah.
potassium.
Nuts, green leafy vegetables.
Yep.
Yeah, all good stuff to be consuming.
Yeah.
Interesting. Now, you mentioned manganese earlier and how important that is for mitochondrial function. So, where are we getting manganese? That's one that most people, unless you are, in our world, right? You're not hearing a whole lot about manganese out there in mainstream media. So, let's talk a little bit about that, what it does and where you get that. What are the best food sources?
So manganese is probably one of the most common mineral deficiencies because it's in such limited amounts of foods. And so typically, unless you're eating certain types of fish in very high amounts, it's very difficult to get manganese if you're on a carnivore diet. So most people probably need a manganese supplement if you're eating animal foods. Now, if you are eating some unrefined whole grains, then you can get manganese in fairly decent amounts. And that's why I consume Ezekiel bread, because it helps give me manganese, magnesium, and a few other minerals that are kind of missing in animal foods.
Interesting. So, it's mostly going to be in your whole grains, is what you're saying.
Yes. But I mean, the problem with that is that 99% of whole grains in the United States are highly refined. So it's really trying to find those true unrefined traditional whole grains, because you don't really know from a label if the flour is ran through a steel roller mill and it's just going to spike your glucose. So what typically I look for is just a sprouted grain and no flour. Just avoid anything that says flour typically.
Right. So the Ezekiel bread. Now, would you say that, so what I'm hearing is that if somebody's following a real food keto diet, so if they're following a low carb diet, they're taking out grains, they're not consuming legumes, different things like that. Would they be more at risk for mineral deficiencies? Or is there a lower need for minerals when your insulin levels are lower?
Right. So compared to like the standard American diet, I would say no, that they're not at a higher risk, except for certain nutrients. One being manganese.
Interesting. Yeah. Because I think a lot of the research, looking at minerals and how much minerals we need, is probably done on people that are trending more insulin resistant.
Yeah, true.
So I'm thinking that, and this is just my hypothesis, that possibly the more insulin sensitive we are, the better we are at driving minerals into the cell and, obviously being able to utilize it. So we may need less. We may need a little bit less.
100%. Yeah. So, I mean, magnesium, potassium, you have to use insulin to drive them to the cell.
Right. It's hard to do that research though. You have to find all these people with a certain level of, fasting insulin and then see what they need. Right. So,
true.
Yeah. But, that's just an idea that, hey, the better your blood sugar stability is, right, the better, of course, also the better your stomach acid levels are in your gut microbiome. The possibly the lower the amount of some of these minerals that you may need in your diet.
For sure.
Because you're going to absorb them better.
Yeah.
Cool. And I know that coffee as well. A lot of people are drinking a lot of coffee.
Yeah.
And what does coffee do, particularly to salt?
Yeah, that was one of the biggest eye openers when I was researching for the salt fix, is that caffeine, and particularly coffee, because there's
Yeah.
other compounds in coffee besides just caffeine, is a tremendous salt waster, both sodium and chloride, to the extent where if you consume 4 cups of coffee, you lose an additional half a teaspoon of salt. And it's the most commonly consumed beverage around the world, second to only water. So most of us are consuming some form of coffee or caffeinated beverage. Probably when you add up caffeinated beverages plus coffee, it probably
It's a lot.
takes over water, to be
Right.
honest.
Yeah, you're right. So people are drinking so much caffeine and you're depleting salt. You said 4 cups of coffee, which is roughly equivalent to what, like 300 milligrams of caffeine or so,
Yeah,
300 or
typically
400.
like 80 times 4, whatever that is,
Yeah, so
320.
320 milligrams of caffeine, and you're losing a full teaspoon. Did you say?
A half
A teaspoon of salt. So this is why it's important. I have an article on my website about 5 ways to make your coffee more effective. One of the ways is actually adding salt to your coffee. Put the salt in there.
Yeah, it's a great strategy.
Yeah. And so that way, obviously the minerals that you're losing, you're getting back. And also, of course, when people are exercising, right, which hopefully you guys are that are listening, you're also losing the salt there too.
Right. Very true.
Good. Now, are there any like sort of sports drinks, or can somebody make like a homemade sports drink that you would recommend that kind of adds in some of these things?
So what's interesting is that a lot of the information on sports performance, they were just simply trying to replace the salt that is lost through sweat during exercise. And that makes sense that that would be enough. But what ends up happening when you undergo fairly high intensity performance is that the blood flows to the working muscle. And then as core body temperature rises, it also starts pulling away from the muscle into the skin to release heat. So you have this drop in blood volume that occurs with exercise. And it happens, pretty quickly. Within 5 or 10 minutes, you can lose 10% of the blood volume to the heart. So boosting blood volume before exercise with high salt solutions actually dramatically improves performance, both in the heat and at room temperature. So there's been a lot of studies that have looked at this, and really the best regimen is you start ingesting these high salt solutions about 90 minutes prior to competition or exercise, and you slowly consume it over 60 minutes, 30 minutes before the event. And you boost blood volume by about 8%, and thus preventing the drop that occurs during performance.
Wow, that's good to know. I know my friend Rob Wolf, he's got one called Element. I don't know if you've heard of that, but it's very high in sodium, and you taste it right away. It doesn't have any of the sugar and all that kind of stuff. So I've been using that and definitely noticing an improvement with it. But it is salty, so you got to be careful. You gotta water it down and drink it over time, like you were saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, super important. So, really good stuff. And your typical stuff that's out there, Gatorade, Powerade. I mean, there's just so much sugar and additives and artificial flavorings. They do have the sodium in there, but I guess
it's about 1/10. It's about 1/10 the sodium though that you actually should.
Yeah, it's low. Yeah, it's like
really low.
Right.
And like you said, even if you get like Gatorade Zero, it's the sugar doesn't really matter too much.
Yeah.
It doesn't really help that much. It's the salt that's really going to be boosting the blood volume.
Yeah. So the benefits people are getting are from the salt that's in there, but obviously it doesn't have as much salt as you need, which makes it actually probably more palatable, right? Because it's not overly salty. So people are drinking more and more and more of it.
Right.
Which they do get hydration up, but of course, if they've got the sugar in there, the additives, artificial flavorings, all of that stuff's going to have a detrimental effect.
Exactly. And if you don't get the salt solution fairly close, it doesn't have to be exactly, but fairly close to the saltiness of the blood, it's going to be difficult to boost blood volume. So you can replace some of the salt loss through sweat, which is great, but the enhancement of performance, you really need those higher salt solutions.
Yeah. Now, do you have any like quick homemade recipes that somebody, like, let's say they're going to go work out later on today and they don't have any of these products at home, but they've got some salt, maybe some bicarbonate or whatever. What's like a homemade recipe that somebody can make?
So what I typically do is I use the 1,000 milligram to 10 ounces of fluid rule.
Mm-hmm.
And typically, if I'm going to do something high intensity, I'll have at least 2,000 milligrams of sodium and 20 ounces of fluid. I'll do that, start 90 minutes before. I'll
Yeah.
slowly consume that. And I'll also make sure I typically add about 4 grams of glycine to the solution, makes it more palatable, helps you absorb the sodium in the fluid better. And glycine also cools core body temperature down on its own. So it's a great way to spike the salt solution to just make it more palatable and enhances its benefits.
Wow. Very interesting. Really, really good stuff. And so, Dr. James, your new book, The Mineral Fix, really, really great book. I mean, we touched on some of these key minerals and how important they are. Can you give just another overview and anything that we missed that the listener may be interested in getting this book?
You and I briefly touched on it, and that is the fact that the first thing to fix mineral deficiencies is to heal your own health, reduce the refined carbohydrates and sugar, get the inflammation down, stop eating the junk and the garbage. So get the junk out of the kitchen. And then you can start absorbing and utilizing the nutrients and your minerals better. And then from there, you can start building a healthy diet in basically optimizing different minerals using and I have some strategies in the book, which foods you should combine to get a full spectrum, optimal amount of minerals.
Yeah, really good stuff. So a lot of food combination types of principles, so you can be eating and getting the full nutritional synergy. So really good stuff, guys. Check out his book, The Mineral Fix. He's also got some other great books. If you want to learn a deep dive on salt, he has got The Salt Fix, The Longevity Solution, The Immunity Fix, with everything that's been going on with COVID and whatnot. This is a really timely book that he wrote last year, The Immunity Fix. You want to give a quick summary of that?
Yeah, the immunity fix was basically that we were sort of hyper focusing on vaccines and masks, and we weren't looking at the major risk factor, which is poor metabolic health, and that's driven through poor diet and poor mineral status. And if you fix those things, any type of virus is much less virulent.
Yeah, absolutely. So some great books to pick up, guys. You will really enjoy Dr. James's books. He's got a bunch of them out there. So if you want to learn how to optimize your health today, optimize your immune system, and then live longer as well, he's got the longevity fix as well. So check that out. And again, his website is Dr. James Dinnick, DINIC.com. You can sign up for his newsletter there. Check him out on social media, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook as well. Dr. James, thanks so much for your time. Any last words of inspiration for our audience?
I would say don't fear salt, fear sugar. That's my key slogan.
I love it. So good. Thanks again, Dr. James. And guys, we'll see you on a future podcast. Be blessed, everybody.